Hi everyone, and welcome back to KidLit Corner. I'm really excited today to have special guest Tania Ingram joining us. Tania is a children's author known for her Ginny and Cooper series, as well as Aggie Flea is Not a Liar, and the sequel, Aggie Flea Steals the Show. Book one, Aggie Flea is Not a Liar, was a CBCA notable last year in 2024. Tanya also had two picture books out last year, The Bug Book with Little Book Press and Walls. But the book we're going to be discussing today is a book that was one of my absolute favorite reads of last year. It's a middle grade novel called The Other Shadow. Tanya lives and writes in Adelaide, and you can find her on Facebook and on Instagram to connect with her online. The talk today is a really important topic that is not often seen or discussed in children's literature or the world at large very much, but The Other Shadow is a really terrific voice and advocate for mental health in families, parents, and how children are affected by it. So, Tanya, could you start by maybe just letting us sort of briefly know anyone who hasn't read it, what The Other Shadow is about?
Okay. Hi, thanks for having me. The Other Shadow is a story effectively about a boy who is haunted, for want of a better word, haunted by a disembodied shadow after the death of his father. And so at first, the shadow is playful and childlike, but as the story progresses, we start to see another side of the other shadow, and the relationship that the boy has with the other shadow begins to change as we begin to see more of what's happening in his world and things start to unravel. That's in a nutshell what I'd say.
I think it's also important to say that I should have said in the intro that in your past life you did work as a clinical psychologist.
Yeah.
How much did that come into play? Or maybe I should go from the start and say sort of what prompted the sort of the impetus for writing this book in the first place, and what was that process like, and how being a psychologist maybe fed into that.
Yeah. So I guess the reason why I wrote the book in the first place was because I saw a niche in the market for this sort of book. Um, there are books about mental health out there, which is great. We're seeing a lot more books, children's books particularly, that are talking about mental health. But often they're just sort of light touches into it.
Yeah.
And I wanted to write a book that really did a deep dive over a longer period of time of what it was actually like living with someone who has a mental health issue. And particularly, I think that children's stories, children of parents with mental health, their stories aren't often told. And when they are, they're only told in terms of just one episode, which is like almost like a very it's almost like a really linear kind of thing. A parent gets sick, they see a doctor, they get better, and life goes back to normal. But in reality, mental health is more like this. It's, really highs. The parent has a really bad day. They might have a really, just a few little bumps along the way. And it's something that extends. So I wanted to sort of look at a more macro take on mental health rather than just a one episode thing and what kind of things that children actually go through. So I think for me, working particularly, I worked with kids. The majority of my work, I did work with adults too, but the majority of my work was with kids. And I worked with kids that were like Thomas and Tilly, children and families where there was a parent with a mental health problem. And I could see families trying really hard to do their best, but then the mental health issue would just overwhelm everything and swamp everyone in the family. So I thought it was really important to tell their story. And also, we have a lot of children. I think there's something they were saying about it was over 40,000 children in out of home care in Australia. So that's in foster placements and homes and living with people other than their parents for various reasons. Yet we have so few books that tell their stories. So I wanted to make sure with this story that we also included a bit about the foster care system and what it's like for children bouncing through the foster care system as well, because there's so many children out there, that's their reality, that's their experience. So for me, it was a partly from personal experience growing up and also my work with children who have parents with mental health issues that really made me want to write this book. And I saw that there was a niche in the market for that.
I'm curious what your process was of writing it and rewriting it. Was it difficult? Did you find you were sort of maybe being hesitant or censoring yourself with any parts or not sure what to
Yeah,
include or how it changed from first draft to the finished book? What was that sort of general process like for you?
yeah. It did go through quite a few changes from the original. When I first wrote it, it actually came out quite easily. And I think I wrote the first draft over about a roughly a 2 month period. There was one catch. The original book, all of the chapters were actually only 500 words. So
Oh,
every chapter was 500 words. And that came from back in my day when I was an intern. Um, I remember having a child who had trauma as a teen. And I remember having a session with this kid and then going to my supervisor and saying, like, man, like, an hour, I was lucky to get 500 words out of this kid. And my supervising saying, for a child with trauma, 500 words is fantastic. Aim for 500 words and you're doing well. And so originally, when I wrote the book, it was all in these little 500 word chapters. And then I got to, I think it was about chapter 19 or 20, where Thomas tells someone for the first time about the other shadow. And I realized then that I'm going to need more than 500 words to actually tell this part of the story. And in retrospect, I could have left it because it probably would have been a lovely representation of someone confessing and actually being able to open up more than 500 words. But I think it would have been too jarring for particularly for children as readers to suddenly go from these short chapters to this long chapter. So I ended up tossing that and starting again and fleshing out each chapter to what it is. Um, and then there was also things like I had to be really careful about how I was dealing with particularly the mother's mental health because we don't want to demonize the person with the mental health issue. There's enough of that going on in society anyway. So we don't want to do that. We want to show what is actually the reality for most families that I worked with. As I said, most of them were trying their best and doing their, hardest work to stay healthy. But sometimes that's not enough. And so I wanted to make sure that that came across with the mother. So I was really careful the way that I represented her in the book. What she does isn't nice. It can be, quite traumatizing and horrific. But I wanted to kind of separate that from the fact that she's still a loving mother who is trying. So that was something that I also needed to be really aware of. And when I wrote the book, I ended up writing three different endings for the book because the publishers were sort of saying, "Oh no, we can't take it down that way. That's a little bit too heavy." And then the second one was, "Oh, actually, that's a bit too scary now. We can't do that." And I was saying, "But that's the reality." And they're like, "Yeah, but we can't. That's too much." So I had to kind of pull it back to the ending that we have now, which was like a nice happy balance.
yeah.
So yeah, it was a process.
I won't spoil the ending, but what I like about the ending and about the book, overall, is there is hope, there is optimism, and there are light moments,
Yeah,
but you don't shy away from the reality. As you say, it is not, as you said, it is not a linear episode. It is ups and downs in mental health, just as it is in the book. So I felt it was really important that you did that, that you sort of showed it's not all happy, rosy families, and that there are
mm,
people in these situations who cannot help the mental health disorder they have, and they are still trying to keep the family together. So it
yeah,
brought a great sense of realisticness to it that I think kids will really appreciate, and families and health professionals and anyone who reads it will, because there's, as you say, there's the foster families, um, that Thomas in the book actually lives with a couple different ones, which I
Mm,
didn't know much about the foster care. I just read some books about it, but I thought it was interesting how he didn't just find one foster family and then everything was perfect. There was some not so nice families. So I
yeah.
that must have been a realistic path that you had seen in your mental health professional career as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And that's exactly how it is. It sometimes for whatever reason, and it might be no fault of the family or no fault of the child, but sometimes there's just not that connect
yeah,
and the fit's not right. And sometimes we need to. And I mean, quite often you see foster things. When you hear about foster, it's usually something terrible on the news, that
yeah,
there's something dreadful's happened, and it's particularly with foster children. So you do have these really awful situations. But within the foster care system, there are a lot of fantastic people working behind the scenes who are working in a really, really hard system to try and do the best for the kids.
yeah.
But sometimes it doesn't always work out.
Absolutely. And you really displayed that really beautifully in the book with a family that was maybe not the best fit for Thomas and Tilly, but then a family that they really meshed with and melded with. I
Mm.
also really loved the voice of Thomas, who is our protagonist, and you said before how it goes over a few years, from when he's 10 to about 13, I think it is.
Yeah.
And you write the book in the first person voice of Thomas very authentically. For example, there's a passage that I really love where he's Thomas feels he's been let down and lied to by every adult, by his mum, uh, by the foster care supervisor, by foster care family, by teachers at school who make promises and never keep them. And he sort of says this little inner monologue about how adults tell kids not to lie, but it's the adults who are doing the lying sort of most of all.
Mm.
You tapped into the emotions of that kid voice so wonderfully and their thoughts. Was that difficult or did it come naturally? How was it sort of putting yourself in that 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old boy voice? Because you really captured it, I
Oh,
thought, so beautifully.
yeah. I mean, I've had quite a lot of experience, both personally, with my own family growing up, but also working with a lot of kids like this, where I've had a lot of sessions with them, and I think it was really easy to tap into that. But that being said, it was also really emotional. There were times when I was writing the book when I was just like absolutely
Yeah.
flooding with tears. And I think when I finally finished the book, I ended up going and I finished, the end, that's it, it's done. And I went and got in the bath and I just cried for about half an hour because it was just such an overwhelming sort of letting out all of this stuff from my own experience, from all the kids that I've worked with, from some of the children that I desperately just wanted to take and, I
Yeah.
would have brought them all home and try to protect them. But there's only so much you can do because of the system that we live in. And so, yeah, I think that really helped. It was really quite a vulnerable experience to write the book, but it was also quite cathartic at the same time. But I think, yeah, all of those combination of factors is what helped make that voice authentic.
Yeah. I think when reading the book, that definitely comes out, that vulnerability and that emotion and that personal experience that you've put in. It really is sort of this undercurrent beneath the text, beneath the story that I think comes out really wonderfully. And that's why I think that The Other Shadow is a book that is such a standout because, as you say, you wanted to take that deep dive into the mental health of families and how the children are affected, because it's not
Yeah,
often touched upon in novels. Why do you think that it is still
yeah,
such a taboo topic in children's books or books in general or the world in general from your perspective as a previous mental health
yeah.
worker and now writer? Why do you think we're still sort of so afraid of it?
I think it's probably a combination of things. One is that society hasn't caught up yet. We're not quite like we're making headways, and we are certainly better, perhaps in terms of mental health than what we were sort of 50 years ago, but there's still a long way to go. I think the biggest thing with children's books, though, is there is, and I've heard this about The Other Shadow as well, is there is a fear of triggering, of saying, oh, well, and I've had teachers and librarians say this to me, like, oh, this is a fantastic book, we love it, but I'm not sure about using it in the classroom. It might be a bit triggering. But what I always say is triggers are always seen as a bad thing, but triggers are actually emotions that are just waiting in the wings. Those things already exist. They're already there. And so triggers can actually be a positive thing too. They can actually be a way of opening a door to a meaningful discussion about something. And particularly with children, I know, and I mean, this is a much bigger area, but particularly with children, um, triggers can be better handled when your brain is young and malleable and you haven't laid all your neural pathways. It's a lot harder for someone sort of in their 60s or 50s, 60s to deal with a trauma that's happened when they were younger. Because not to say that their brains can't still lay neural pathways, but it's harder than what it is for a child. So for a child to be triggered, and that's why whenever I talk to students about The Other Shadow, I do actually say to them, this book might bring up feelings and emotions, and it might make you feel scared, or it might make you feel sad or angry or whatever. If you find that it really stays with you, then go and talk to an adult, talk to your parents, talk to teachers, librarians, your school counselor, your school chaplain. And then at the end of the book, I have actually got listed at the end of the book, there's the Kids Helpline, there's Beyond Blue and Headspace, and all of those things. I included those at the end of the book as well, so that they do have outlets. But I think now at the moment, we still see triggers as being a negative thing rather than seeing them as a part of a process to positive mental health. So I think that's one of the reasons why we don't touch on these topics very often in kids' books. We are seeing lots of change, though. We're seeing
Yeah.
lots of fantastic change. YA books in particular, for many years have covered mental health issues. And even in picture books now, we're seeing a few picture books that deal with things like grief or different emotions, or even things which I'm loving, transgender issues like, Red, the Crayon Story, or My Shadow is Pink,
Yeah.
all of those sorts of books. And by doing that, we normalize those things in society. And that's what we need to be doing with mental health. We need to normalize it to make kids from a really young age understand that no matter how and where you are on the mental health line, that there are always positive
Yeah.
pathways out. So I always say, if I had a teacher ask me, what do you do if a kid's triggered by a particular thing in the book? And I said, well, you can, it depends obviously how triggered they are. There's no one size fits all here. But you can always say to them, well, yeah, that's, I can see that's really affected you. And why don't we read a bit more? Why don't we see what happens? Let's see how Thomas deals with this and see how Thomas deals with his triggers and by the stuff that's happening to him. So take them on the journey, on the path. So that's one of the things I think that's probably blocking, is that there's that fear of,
Yeah.
of being triggering for kids.
I think that's
Yeah.
so wonderful how you express that, the emotions, they're waiting in the wings, um,
Mm.
under that guise of triggers. And I think that's a really great way to put it. And I'm sure everyone
Yeah.
watching this video could take away from that, adults and kids as well, of what you
Well,
say.
you can't trigger something that's not already there.
Yeah, exactly.
And so to think, if, say, for example, the father passes away at the beginning of the book, and there might be a child who's had a parent pass away, and that might bring up some feelings of that, but that child's already experiencing those feelings. They're going through it. It's not something that doesn't already exist. It's not in isolation. You're not bringing on that feeling because of it. It's already there. It's just waiting in the wings. And so this brings it up, and it helps them process again and again. And the more the process, the more they can actually move past.
Exactly. And so what comes to mind for me as you say this and as I was reading the book is I didn't think about triggers when I was reading it. I thought about representation of something that as you have said, there has not been that much representation of. So whereas someone might think a child who has experienced a parent with mental illness might feel triggered by it, they might also feel not so alone. They might feel, oh, it
Yeah,
does happen to other people because Thomas is, he goes to some different schools in the book and he sort of doesn't want to tell anyone what's going on at home with his mum or with anything. And
yeah,
I found that that was interesting because there's often so much talk of shame and how kids or
yeah.
adults they're ashamed of this and they don't need to be. Thomas has to sort of act like a mini adult often in the book, as though he's caring for his mum and her emotional needs at times. So
Yeah.
releasing that trigger, as you say, would be really wonderful because I have you experienced that? Do you think that there's some shame attached to the stigma, maybe, of not talking about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really it's a really tricky situation, and it's the way our society is currently functions. And I don't want to sort of generalize mental health here, but let's take some scenarios that you have a scenario like in the book where you've got a child who is being quite neglected and a parent who is completely overwhelmed by their mental illness. And that child, as you said, they become the parent. And so they start doing things to protect their parents. They might make sure they get to the doctor or they're taking their medication. They might be doing things like, not looking after other siblings and making sure that everyone has food for their lunchbox and things like that. So that child ends up growing up not really having their own childhood. They end up being sort of an adult from a really young age, and you see that. But then you might have another scenario where you have a family that are doing their very best. And you've got a good mum and dad, and they're a fantastic family, and either mum or dad might have a mental health problem, and they decide that they're going to hide it from the child. We're just going to go on and pretend everything's okay. And they think that children don't know, but let me tell you, children always know. Like children, they are biologically primed to make sense of their world,
Mhm.
especially in those first few years. They, I mean, they're at a point where they're always searching for safety. They're comparing. So they'll see the difference between their parent and another parent, a friend's parent or something, and they'll know what's going on. And if they don't have a language for that or an explanation, then children who are at the point where they're still laying those neural pathways and they're very egocentric, they don't have empathy properly developed at that stage. So they'll make it about themselves. So it'll be, oh, dad, and I have had situations like this, dad hurt himself because I didn't, clean my room. I didn't do this or I didn't do that. So, that's why dad hurt himself. They'll kind of make the connection, make it about themselves. Or you can have a situation where you have a parent who will say, mummy or daddy has a mental health issue, but we're not going to tell anyone. This is just in the family. You're not allowed to tell anyone else. So that child goes to school, again, is seeing teachers and other people that are different from their own parent. They're beginning to kind of feel resentment because they can't tell anyone about what's going on, and there's a sense of shame around it. It's going to be a secret, it's going to be quiet, so it's shameful. And so that child ends up being quite resentful as well because of the fact that that they can't talk about it. And then, like the last scenario I would say would be a parent who is very open. Mum or dad has a mental health issue. We'll be open with the child. We'll tell the child, you can tell all your friends, you can tell whoever you want. We're not ashamed. There's no shame around this. So that child then goes to school and tells their best friend, and their best friend goes and tells their parents that, oh, so-and-so's, Thomas's mum has bipolar. And so that parent, the best friend's parent, then starts going, oh, well, is my child going to be safe having a sleepover there or going to that party or going to their house? And so that child then becomes isolated from that reason. So there's no right answer to be able to say because it's a bigger issue. It's an issue with society and the way that we view mental health. And I always say, if the shoe doesn't fit, we don't cut off the foot. We look for a different shoe. And this is exactly the same. If society isn't like working the right way to support people with mental health, we don't kind of blame the people with the mental health. We look for a different way of functioning. And I think at the moment, particularly, there is a staggering lack of empathy, particularly for people with mental health issues. You see them on TikTok and, people that are always doing these, particularly younger people, are always doing these things on TikTok and they're labeled as Karens, or you see people that are particularly distressed, and instead of people kind of going, that person, wow, there's something really wrong there, they'll pull out their camera and they'll start videoing them. And adults do this as well, not just kids. But there's a staggering lack of empathy around, and the empathy that does exist at the moment, I'm seeing, which is what I would call performance empathy, which is where, and you see this a lot on social media too, where you have someone who will go and give a homeless person a bag of food and say, oh, here we go. But they video it and they put it up on
Yeah.
social media. But it's not true empathy, it's performance empathy,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I think, yeah, that's when it comes to a lot of the changes that are happening because of things like social media. Empathy is something that is really lacking at the moment in our society, and particularly empathy around issues like mental health and stuff like that.
I completely agree. I totally get what you're saying, and I know so many other people will definitely feel the same way. And I
Mhm.
think that reading books is a great way to learn empathy. Reading The Other Shadow
Yeah,
is a great way to do that. Because I
yeah,
think it's basically about how would you feel if that was you, putting
yeah.
yourself
And
in
can
someone
I
else's
just
shoes.
tell you a story that happened to
Yeah.
me last year? Because I wrote this book for kids who were in this situation to be able to see themselves and know that there is an out. But I also wrote it for other children who may be more fortunate and not understand. Last year, I was at a school event and I had a boy come up to me and he said, I've just read The Other Shadow. And I went, okay, well, that's great. What did you think? And he said, yeah, it was really good. And then he said, oh, there's this kid in my class. He really stinks. And I went, oh, okay. And then he said, yeah, maybe I'm thinking maybe I shouldn't tease him anymore. And that for me was just like a yes,
Yeah.
and it shows the power of stories and also shows the power of really good librarians who know how to put the right book in the right hands, which is also something, in itself that's so important. But it shows that power of story. And I just wanted to, and then he said, oh, and after my response of, that's great. And we high-fived and I just wanted to hug him. And I thought, no, 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 high five. And then I said, I'm really proud of you. And he was really chuffed with himself. And then he said, I'm going to tell my friends not to tease him anymore either. And I was like,
Oh,
yes. So that's the power of books like this.
exactly.
In the right
Exactly.
hands, it is
Yeah.
really great.
That is wonderful. Wow. And what a difference that will make, in that kid's life, the kid that he's not
Mm,
going to tease now, and
yeah.
that's such a wonderful effect.
Yeah.
Um,
Fraction of empathy. It's
yeah,
wonderful.
exactly. Well, what about some other responses? Like, have you had you mentioned that boy, you've mentioned some of the teachers and librarians you said, oh, maybe not for the classroom, but have you had any other um really great responses from other kid readers or even mental health
Yeah.
professionals who might have read it
Yeah.
or known about it that you can share with us? What has that response
Yeah.
been?
I've had a lot of responses, and I have had a lot of teachers and librarians actually say that they really enjoyed the book and that they love the book, and some that are going to be sharing it with their classes, which is great. Um, I've had mental health professionals. I have had people contact me and say, oh, we're going to start using this, with various people, and I'm taking it and I'm going to be showing other people in the mental health about this as well. I've had a foster parent contact me and kind of say, well, wow, it's really made me rethink, and
Yeah.
I've never really asked the child what they went through. We're always kind of like, don't ask, just care for now. So he said it's actually made me rethink that. And I had a lovely one last year as well, where a lady in her, I think she would be in her mid to late 70s, contacted me at an event. She came up to me at an event and she said, I've just finished reading The Other Shadow. I grew up with a mum who was bipolar, and your book validated my experience. And she was really emotional. And she said, I feel like the child in me was actually validated for the first time ever. And
Oh,
that was just such a beautiful moment to
yeah.
have that kind of feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. And I totally see why they would think that. I, to anyone watching this who hasn't read this yet, you must please go buy a copy. It is really fantastic. And I know we've talked a lot about the mental health aspects of it, but the book is not didactic. It's not a textbook or anything like that. It's not dry. It is a beautiful human story about children, family, love, connection, and how it looks in many different forms. And it is really beautifully written, a wonderful story. Uh, Page 209 in this book makes me cry every time I've read it, and I've read this book 5 times. I kid you not, every time I know it's coming. I'm not going to say what happens on page 209, but it is so moving and so, so beautiful. So I really implore everyone to read this. It's, as Tanya's been saying, the power of stories and empathy, and this book is such a great touchstone for that. I think I just want to end, Tanya, by asking you where to from here? Like I think this book, which has taken a deep dive into mental health, has been such a powerful book. And as we've discussed, there's been other picture books and YA books about it before that maybe have lightly touched it or gone into it a bit deeper. So I'm wondering what you think, sort of what needs to happen next. Like if there's someone else out there who wants to write about a mental health aspect that they've experienced themselves, or maybe that they haven't experienced, but they want to write a book about it for kids or young adults. Do you think um, it's important that we're going to have many more books like The Other Shadow? Do you think that there will be more like that, like this book, or there should be
Yeah.
more, or what sort of advice maybe, or do you have for people who might want to make sure that um, we have more books like this?
I think it's important to keep writing the stories because there's people out there who you don't know, with any book really, you don't know who your story is going to reach or who your story is going to touch. And for me, if The Other Shadow was a book that only touched that 70-odd-year-old woman,
Yeah.
or it only touched that boy who wasn't going to tease the kid in his class anymore, that's enough. That one person is better than nothing. And I know that it has touched more people than that, but it is, I would say, persist because it is a really important area. I think the only way we're going to normalize mental health is if we bring it into like make more of a dialogue around it, and we bring it into our culture a lot more in our communities and our schools, and we talk about it more openly. So really take away all of those shadows about mental health. And I think, I would say to people, it's not an easy sell. It is a difficult book to get out there. I do know for me personally that there have been some bookstores that have declined from taking it because of its topic, or schools that have declined for the same reason. But just know that it does get out there to some people and it does actually make a difference. So anything you can do to participate and open up those dialogues, the better, I think. So I would encourage everyone, if you want to do it, go ahead and write it.
Yeah.
It's really important.
Wonderful. I think that's a wonderful note that we'll end this chat on. So once again, the book is The Other Shadow by Tania Ingram. It's published by Scholastic. It is genuinely one of my favorite books and was
Thank
my
you.
favorite book of 2024 when it was published last year in 2024. The absolute best book I read last year. So please buy a copy, beg, borrow, steal, do whatever you have to do. Give it to friends, give it to kids and teachers and parents, and everyone should really read it, and it will have an amazing impact on you. I want to thank you, Tanya, for chatting with us and sharing your knowledge behind the book and about the mental health aspects of it. I think it's a really important thing to talk about. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.